Is nature God? An Aristotelian examination of the philosophy of Spinoza. Baruch Benidictus Spinoza was born to a prominent Portuguese Jewish family in Amsterdam in 1632. As a star pupil of the community Talmud Torah school, Spinoza spent his formative years preparing for a career as a rabbi. Yet on July 27, 1656, a herem, the harshest writ of excommunication ever pronounced by the Shabbatic community of Amsterdam, was issued to Spinoza. It is unknown precisely what monstrous deeds or heresies Spinoza committed, but he remained obstinate in them, as this herem was never rescinded. Many have speculated the beliefs that led to this excommunication could be found in the body of one of his first works, the short treatise on God, Man, and His Well-Being, as it was compiled in 1661, the year Spinoza left Amsterdam for Regensburg. The treatise was Spinoza's initial but eventually aborted effort to lay out his metaphysical, epistemological, and moral views. It also served as the launching point for his more famous work, Ethics. The purpose of this presentation is to evaluate and refute the central claim made by Spinoza: God and nature are one and the same thing. Spinoza opens the discourse by first proving that God is, through an a priori argument. The argument is as follows: something which can be clearly and distinctly understood belongs to the nature of a thing. It is this thing that we can truly affirm. If we can clearly and distinctly understand that existence belongs to God's nature, we can then truly affirm the existence of God. Alternative to this first proof, he offers a second. The essences of things are from all eternity and will remain immutable to all eternity. God's existence is his essence. Therefore, God's existence is from all eternity and will remain immutable to all eternity. Next, Spinoza offers a proof from an a posteriori position. This is done by examining the relation between thought and object. The fact that man has an idea of God means that the cause of this idea must exist formally and contain within itself whatever the idea has objectively. Satisfied with these proofs, Spinoza moves on to define what God is. Chapter 2 opens with Spinoza informing the reader: God, the first cause of all things and also the cause of himself, makes himself known through himself. Pulling from what appears to be a common conception of his time, he confirms a common thought between himself and his reader when he states, he is, we say, a being of which all or infinite attributes are predicated, each of which is infinitely perfect in its own kind. However, this is possibly the first and last of commonality of thought, as it is from here that he begins the introduction of a new concept of God, a God that is the being nature and God. Spinoza sets about to prove this claim through an examination of substance, in which 4 claims are proposed and defended. Of the 4 claims, first he claims there is no limited substance, but that every substance must be infinitely perfect in its kind, that in God's infinite intellect no substance can be more perfect than that which already exists in nature. Second, that there are not 2 equal substances. Third, that one substance cannot produce another. Fourth, and finally, that in God's infinite intellect there is no substance which does not exist formally in nature. This last premise is elaborated with 4 additional points. The first of which centers around God's infinite power and the fact that there can be no cause in him by which he could create one thing sooner or more than another. The second centers around the simplicity of God's will. The third is a claim that God cannot omit doing any good, while the last and final claim states that it is impossible that what does not exist now could come to be, since one substance cannot produce another. Feeling as if he has provided sufficient reason and proof, Spinoza concludes with his objective claim. From all of these, it follows that nature, all in all, is predicated, and that thus nature consists of infinite attributes, of which each is perfect in its kind. This agrees perfectly with the definition one gives God. God and nature are one. There is nothing that is in God's infinite intellect that does not formally exist in nature. Therefore, all diversity seen in nature are only attributes and perfections of the one being. This argument for oneness follows from the previous claim that it is impossible for nothing to produce something. Therefore, there must be a being of which all things are predicated. This being is substance, and as one substance cannot produce another, and as nature comes from no cause, yet is known to exist, nature must necessarily be the perfect being to which all existence belongs. At this point, Spinoza shifts his attention to dealing with how oneness can be if many are observed, i.e., numerical difference, and if generation and destruction occur. This, he explains, is due to the two primary attributes of God, thought and extension. In the first attribute, thought, we find human ability to reason to part and whole. However, this is nothing more than a product of reason, as the true state of nature is necessarily one. Generation and destruction, or the coming into being and going out of being, is the combination of both God's attributes and happens only in the mode. Nature, as God, is not a being acted on, thus any change or division can only occur in the mode. As there is nothing outside of God, every action is the one that proceeds of God on himself, as he is immanent cause. He facilitates our understanding, this change of mode in our reason, as our reason is an extension of his own thought. So, when a man perishes or is destroyed, that is only understood of the man insofar as he is a composite being and a mode of substance, and not the substance itself on which he depends. Concluding the rebuttal to these objections, Spinoza asserts substance as the principle of all its modes has a greater right to be called agent than the one that is acted on. Yet there is one last objection to be attended to before he rests his case of the oneness of nature and God, and this is the objection that there must necessarily be a first cause, which makes a body move, as that which is at rest cannot move itself. As motion and rest are clearly found in nature, this must proceed from an external cause. Spinoza explains this apparent contradiction by restating the fact that nature is a being of which all attributes are predicated. Motion is a product, and nature can produce everything that is needed. In the concluding lines of his discussion on what God is, Spinoza formally establishes thought and extension as the two primary attributes of God. He informs his reader that everything other than these, such as existing through himself, being eternal, one, or immutable, or being a predeterminer and ruler of things, must either belong to him as an intrinsic denomination or be in respect to his actions. Examining substance. Having sufficiently presented Spinoza's argument, let us turn now and evaluate it. We will do this by examining substance, the very thing Spinoza uses to investigate and establish his claim. For the keen reader, this is immediately a problem, as the definition of substance is not provided directly by Spinoza. Thus, the type of substance the author is referring to must be gathered from the text. Implications that this is a material substance come from the first claim. In God's infinite intellect, no substance can be more perfect than that which already exists in nature. Yet, this still presents a problem, as nature is defined further in the text as the substantial extension of God. If one leans into the reference to the ordering of the natural world as in the description of the formation of water into ice, then one once more goes back to a material definition of substance proceeding from the common understanding of nature being a mobile substance. Yet, if one has an Aristotelian understanding of substance, then there is the recognition that substance can be mobile or immobile. Thus, seeing God and substantial extension would lead this reader to conclude the substance Spinoza is speaking of must be immaterial. This is further confirmed if one works directly from his initial proof, in which he states existence is God's essence. As existence is a universal and thus immaterial concept, substance as it is referred to, must be immaterial. If one decides to step outside of the text to Ethics, a later work by Spinoza, the reader will find the following. By substance, I understand what is in itself and is conceived through itself, i.e., whose concept does not involve the concept of another thing. A definition of no help, as it seems to have come from the very work the reader is trying to obtain clarity on. Ultimately, this ambiguity leaves the reader with two possible substances, mobile and immobile, or simply with their own definitions of God, nature, and substance, which of course will vary depending on the reader and their particular understanding. While it is possible that Spinoza mistakenly forgot to properly define substance, the fact that the weight of his argument rests on this term makes that lack of definition highly unlikely. The bouncing between terms and the conflation of things commonly understood as being immaterial or material makes this inexactness appear more intentional, as if he needed to leave the term ambiguous to properly establish his claim. Proof for this comes from his own notes using three terms around the term substance. These terms are nothing, something, and God. If God and substance are one and the same, then there is no need for a difference of terms, yet throughout his own notes, Spinoza refers to God and substance. In either case, the whole of Spinoza's argument centers on substance, and it appears that instead of starting from a basis of genuine inquiry, he generated an argument and used terms ambiguously to fit his preconceived theory that God and nature were one and the same. Monism, the attribution of being to one substance, is nothing new in the history of philosophy. Spinoza is just a more recent version of the ancient philosopher Parmenides, spoken of by Aristotle in both the Physics and Metaphysics. Those familiar with Aristotle will remember that Parmenides as being a primary proponent of material being the source of all things. According to this argument, the source of all things were the species of material by which they were made, be it coming into being or being destroyed. Its thinghood, the material, remained the same, but changed its attributes. Because of this, Aristotle tells us, these proponents believe that nothing ever comes into being or perishes, since this sort of nature is always preserved, much in the same way that Aristotle would remain who he is when he becomes more handsome or forgets how to write. Then why, these philosophers argued, would it not be the same for other things? Given the confusion found in Spinoza's argument and his decision to superimpose the definition of God onto substance rather than define either, one can only wonder if he did so because he found himself in the same trap as Parmenides. Once more, Aristotle recounts to the reader, but some of those who said it was one, as though defeated by this inquiry, said that the one and the whole of nature were motionless, not only with respect to coming into being and destruction, but also with respect to every other kind of change, and this is particular to them. This is found in Spinoza's argument when attempting to maintain nature as a whole, and the appearance of many as being nothing more than the product of reason. Parmenides fell back to a position impossible for matter, where Spinoza in his argument must fall back to an immaterial aspect, thought, to justify something contrary to sense information. While Spinoza does not formally articulate the fact that there are actually two, being and non-being, he does subtly make reference to it every time he mentions that something cannot come from nothing. Parmenides, on the other hand, though he acknowledges that the whole of nature is one, of reason, and that, for since he thought it fit that beside being, non-being could not be in any way, he necessarily supposed that being is one and there is nothing else. He subtly acknowledges the need of some sort of cause for movement and drawing things together. This, he speculated, was a residual effect of the God love found in material. To be fair, Spinoza does say that it is not possible for nothing to produce something, but he too, like Parmenides, fails to see that the nothing would be made intelligible by the something, which would necessarily produce two, being and non-being. While there are many more examples of similarities between the two arguments, the fundamental error shared between the two is that change and manyness are impossible. This is due entirely to the belief that there is just one concrete. There are many monisms, but what they all hold in common is the attribute of oneness. Existence monism, as defended by Parmenides and Spinoza, targets objects and counts them by individual tokens. It holds that there is only the one, a concrete object. Thus, the existence monist must always deny that at least one concrete object exists, or deny that one is a concrete object. On your screen, there's a picture of cars. If this is the problem, then one would have to deny that there are not three cars, but only one, or deny that the cars on the screen don't actually exist. They are not a concrete object. They're just a product of one's mind. Monism, as Parmenides shows, is not simply a result of theism. Ancient accounts, we are told through Aristotle, always start with a story of things being made by the gods. The gods in these ancient accounts are always separate from what it is that they have created. In this theological framework, it is understandable why Parmenides concludes that the one concrete object is matter. Spinoza, on the other hand, comes from a monotheistic Judeo-Christian mindset and moves from matter back to God. In what is defined as idealist, Spinoza identifies the one as God and thus identifies nature as being a substantial extension of God. Aristotle, the rebuttal. As Spinoza's argument is a more recent elaboration of Parmenides, it seems only fitting to turn to Aristotle for the proof that there is not simply oneness. First, as it pertains to material, Aristotle informs us of the impossibility of an everlasting thing being composed of elements. This is due to the necessity of the material of which it was composed having to come from abyss. In the way that it came to be, it would only be able to come to be from something that is in potency. As all of those things that are in potency admit to being at work and not being at work, it means that this thing naturally admits to not being. If something admits to not being, then it is not everlasting. If this is a universal truth, then no everlasting independent thing could be composed of elements. Second, being is more than one sort, and in one sense it is a thing that is independent, in another it is of a certain sort, and in another it is of a certain amount. But what sort of being will there be unless non-being is? For every way of being, there are just as many ways of non-being. Furthermore, non-being is ranked equally in number to the ways of attributing being, not to mention things that are false as well as those in potency are also spoken as non-being. It is from potency that coming into being is made possible by coming from what is not to what is in potency, regardless of it, if it is one thing or of many. This is still the case. Therefore, it is necessary to postulate each thing as a being in potency. Of these beings in potencies, some are independent things, others attributes, and others are relations. All, however, share in some underlying thing, even if they might have different material. As it pertains to the case of a specific this, there is a sense of how the this is in many things, so long as it is not a this and a sort of nature. The difficulty, then, is in what manner there are actively many things and not simply one. Finally, we will turn to Thomas Aquinas, the foremost disciple of Aristotle, to provide context and clarity to Spinoza's difficulty around definition. Essence, according to Aquinas, is that which is signified by the definition. As it pertains to definition, an accident is like an essence, as it too can be defined. However, an accident has an incomplete definition, as it must include the subject to be properly defined. Substantial existence results when matter and form are composed. yet neither substantial form nor matter has a complete essence. Aquinas states the following: neither substantial form nor matter has a complete essence, because in the definition of substantial form, that of which it is the form must be put, and thus its definition is by way of an addition of something outside it, as is the case with the definition of accidental form. Thus, nature is the whole which is composed of a substantial form and material, and as such it must necessarily be something that is outside of God in order for it to be defined. In conclusion, those who hold to monism, in order to maintain the assertion of oneness, must always deny that at least one concrete object exists, or deny that one is a concrete object. In Spinoza's case, while trying to affirm nature as God, God becomes the object that is denied. Proceeding from Aquinas' elaboration on substantial existence, Spinoza's definition of nature as the substantial extension of God takes on a whole new level of meaning. If nature is substantial, then nature is a mobile substance, and thus must be a whole composite of form and matter, meaning that it necessarily depends on something outside of itself for definition. If Spinoza were to argue that God was simply the substantial form, then he would limit God's existence, as substantial form does not have absolute existence apart from the thing it informs. Matter, then, would be the condition for God's existence, something that is not possible for that which is its own cause. Even worse, though, is the setup of another paradox surrounding cause. If matter necessarily admits to not being, then God as nature necessarily admits to non-being, and a being that is not should not be called God. Thus, it seems that the words of Aristotle are appropriate when it comes to Spinoza's failure to properly define substance. A small error at the outset ends by being great. From this examination, the outcome is clear. If God necessarily exists, then nature and God exist as separate independent beings that are known in relation to each other. If this is not the case, then God is a non-eternal conditional being who is only defined accidentally.